very much for those very kind words, and thank you to the department for your invitation. It's a real honor to be invited to give the Housman Lecture. Gesina in her office just before we came across the street was rattling off the list of very humbling predecessors that I have as your Housman Lecturer. So it means a lot to me to be here. Thank you very much. Does everyone have a handout or access to a handout? There are a couple of pages at the back which have got references to all the modern articles and books that I'm going to mention. And the handout also has the passages also I'm going to be looking at. I want to say now at the start, don't panic. If we get about 25 minutes in and I still haven't got to page 2 of the handout, and I'm not going to go through all those passages in detail, and I'm going to set the scene in a general way first before getting into some reasonably detailed examination of some of those passages. So as I say, just keep calm. Can you all hear me all right? Is that right? Okay. Well, as Gesina said in her introduction, it was more or less inevitable that I would want to talk about Ovid today on his 2056th birthday. And as I was trying to figure out what aspects of Ovid I would like to talk to you about, I thought I should try and fit this particular lecture into a larger current interest of mine, and that will be, I hope, the subject of my next book, if I ever finish. But I'm currently working on it, which I think is going to happen next month. So the general thing that's interesting me at the moment, and that I've been very lucky in the last term, just finished at Oxford, to be involved with Tobias Reinhardt and Stephen Harrison in running a seminar on this subject. They very generously invited me to join in with him on that. And the general subject is the impact that Cicero had on the Augustan poets. I'm becoming more and more convinced that it really ought to be worthwhile to entertain the hypothesis that Cicero's enormous range of writing is extremely influential on the Augustan poets, for the whole way that they conceived of philosophy and politics and Roman tradition in general, and literary theory and literary history. So my lecture today is a sort of foray into that terrain. It's a preliminary reconnaissance, something of a test case for the hypothesis that Cicero's own constructions of literary theory and history were important for the way that the poets thought about how literary history might work in Rome. Now, the danger, obviously, in a project like this is that you can fall victim to a sort of pan-Ciceronianism. You start to see Cicero everywhere, and it can be easy to lose perspective. Now, I don't for a minute want to suggest that every time Ovid says anything about literary history, he's got Cicero on his mind. That's not the point. Ovid is alert to a whole range of approaches, a whole range of traditions. But even though Ovid is displaying a strong interest in literary history from the very beginning of his career, I want to argue tonight that as Ovid's career went on, he became more and more interested in literary history, and especially in autobiographical literary history, as he sets his own achievement as a poet and his own career as a poet within various histories of poetry. And this, I think, is where Cicero becomes particularly important. So I'm going to be concentrating on the dialogue between Cicero's autobiographical literary history and Ovid's. So Cicero's literary history is going to become more important towards the end of my lecture and towards the end of Ovid's career, because the end phases of Ovid's writings on literary history are, I think, deeply indebted, in particular to Cicero's Brutus, a pioneering work of literary history and literary theory, which was itself written emphatically under the sign of the end of Cicero's own career, the end of the Veritas and the Republic, as he saw it. So as I said, my interest in Ovid's debt to Cicero as a literary historian is part of a general interest in Cicero's influence on the Augustan poets. And I want just to give a quick sketch here of what that general interest of mine looks like at this preliminary stage. And for many years I've had the operating assumption that Cicero's enormous output must have had a decisive impact on the poets who were reading him in their formative years. In fact, for many years now, I've been trying to talk various graduate students of mine into working on this, or into working on bits of it, and none of them have, so I've decided to give it a shot myself. So the larger background then is the impact that Cicero had on Horace and Virgil in particular, but also on Ovid. in their thinking and writing on a wide range of issues, almost all of which find themselves grouping in one way or another under that very large umbrella of the relationship between Greek culture and Roman culture, which Cicero was a pioneer in theorizing. So the idea is to try and recover Cicero as a literary and intellectual challenge for the poets, someone that they work with. The poets aren't just being influenced by Cicero or learning from him, they're finding him a challenging and rewarding predecessor and interlocutor in the hard art of creating a new Greco-Roman culture. So the world that Virgil and Horace grew up in particular was a Ciceronian world. When Cicero published his masterpieces on rhetoric and political philosophy in the late 50s BC, the De Oratore and the De Republica, Virgil was in his late teens. When Cicero was producing his unparalleled torrent of publications on philosophy and on rhetoric and on literary history between February 45 and November 44, Horace was in his late teens and his early 20s, and he was studying at university in Athens with Cicero's son. And Virgil, of course, is only 5 years older. He's studying Naples at the same time. And I remember talking about this with Michael Winterbottom when I was first getting interested in this problem. We were actually sorting out files of examination papers, so it's a moment that stays in your memory. And I remember discussing this with Michael, and he said, this is a very, very impressionable age for bookish people, undergraduate age. And all of this stuff is coming out, and they're reading it as it comes out. Ovid, of course, was born exactly 9 months before Cicero was murdered, and so the world that he grew up in was a world where Cicero simply was the intellectual landscape. So it seems to me that it's worth testing the hypothesis that Cicero's output was formative for the Augustan poets. And until quite recently, it's actually surprising how little work there has been done on this, on what the poets owed to Cicero, considering that in Roman history, up until Cicero, no one had achieved anything remotely comparable in intellectual range to what he had set out to do. Edward Frankl's book on Horace, for example, mentions Horace once in the General Index because he happens to know Trebatus, and there's a friend in common. Brink's great commentaries on Horace's literary epistles are consistently disparaging about the importance of Cicero, and I think they consistently underplay the importance that Cicero has for Horace's work in those epistles. Because he knows it all, of course, and he consistently cites the Cicero, but it's not actually very relevant. I think we can make a case that it is more often relevant than it looks. The same is more or less true of Virgil. Niklas Holzberg's superb new third edition bibliography on the Aeneid, which has only just come out, has got 7 entries under Intia Textualitate Cicero. This is 2 fewer than under Humor on the same page. So it seems scholars think there's less Cicero in the Aeneid than there is Humor. Modern scholars have tended to underplay this possibility of real dialogue with Cicero in the Augustan poets. The ancient tradition is different. If you look at the first item on your handout, you see there this story that Servius tells us in the introduction to his commentary on Eclogue 6. He says, it is moreover said that Eclogue 6 was recited by Virgil to gigantic acclaim, so much so that when Caesarean, the courtesan, whom he calls the chorus in the last poem, the last Eclogue, had Tacet, Eclogue 6 in the theatre, Cicero asked in amazement whose it was, who had written it. And when at length on one occasion he, Cicero, saw him, Virgil, Cicero is said to have said in praise of both himself and Virgil, Magnae spes altera Romae. And Virgil transferred this expression to Ascanius, as the commentators say. Now there is no chance whatever that this story is true, but Cicero and Virgil are the great culture heroes of the Roman classroom. So there's a very strong urge to link them. And it's a little bit like the sort of story that you get where, for example, Lucretius dies on the very day that Virgil assumes the tome of Arenas. So you establish a link between the master and his successor. The idea is that the heir just comes into contact with the master before the master dies. And we should bear this in mind later on when we get to one of Ovid's autobiographical poems, when he says, Religilium vidi tantum. I saw Virgil, but no more. I only just saw Virgil. This looks like a very modest claim, but if we put it into this literary historical tradition, it's actually quite a big claim. I am the heir. Now, at the moment, a lot of my thinking about these issues is basically founded on hunch. In some areas, it's a pretty strong hunch. As far as the impact of Cicero's philosophical work is concerned, Margaret Hubbard already asked in 1975 where Virgil and his peers turned to in order to educate themselves in Hellenistic philosophy. And her question bears repeating. Did they automatically go to the very famously bad prose of Epicurus or Chrysippus in order to learn about Hellenistic philosophy, when they could get a lot more than the basics in page after page of beautiful and recently published Latin from the hand of the greatest master of the language? Now, I don't want to say that they didn't read that or in Greek, but I think they did read that Latin. Now, there has been considerable amount of very good work done on this question recently, the impact of Cicero's philosophy on these poets, from John Knowles, for example, on Cicero's presence in Horace's first book of epistles, to Emily Gowes on his presence in the first book of Horace's Satires, and to Roy Gibson, who's written very interesting things about the influence of Cicero's Deificies on Horace's Odes and Ovid's Ars and Victoria. So I think it'd be worth investigating the degree to which the poet's whole conception of philosophy at Rome is to some extent a Ciceronian one. It seems to me that they will have been struck above all by Cicero's sustained investigation of how Greek philosophy can be put to work at Rome, and of what kinds of adaptations and translations are required in that process. And here's another possible area of depth that we can explore. Cicero was Rome's first major theoretic translation of the poets. I think we'd be very interested in that. Cicero's achievement of assimilating Greek intellectual culture for a new Roman context is one that must have implications for how the Augustan poets conceive of their own epic and lyric projects of large-scale cultural transference. This, after all, is the leading theme of the Aeneid and the Metamorphoses and the Fasti. And Cicero regularly speaks of Greece as now played out, with the torch passing to the new culture, the younger culture of the Romans. So Gildenhart and Zissos, in the article on Ovid's Metamorphoses in your bibliography, touch on this when they say, I quote, that Ovid's conceptual treatment of Greece is not so much Horatian as Ciceronian. They refer to Cicero as calling upon his fellow Romans to follow the practices of their ancestors in ripping out the literary and intellectual spoils from the weakening Hellas and transfer them to Rome. So Cicero models a very competitive and even aggressive relationship to Greece, one which resonates with Ovid, according to Gildenhart and Zissos. Now, I'm giving you an example on the handout from the opening of the second book of the Tuscans. This is a passage that Gildenhart and Zissos refer to in their article. So you see the beginning of that passage from the beginning of Tuscans 2. For this reason, he says, I encourage all who have the capacity to wrest from the now failing grasp of Greece, Iam languenti Graeciae eripiant, the renown won from this field of study, philosophy in other words. So we've done oratory, we've done poetry, and now we're going to do philosophy, and I'm leading the way. And if you look down at the bottom of that extract, the last paragraph there, section 6, it says, once these studies are transferred to ourselves, we shall have no need even of Greek library. So Roman intellectual culture will supersede Greek, make it redundant at Rome, if this works. I think this fits in very well with the way that Gregory Hutchinson, in his new book, describes how the Romans liked to write their version of literary history in such a way that the vitality of Greek literary history stops when their own literature begins. Polemachus very conveniently dies right around the time when the Romans, for the first time, start staging translations of Greek plays into Latin, which is the date that people like Cicero eventually look back on as the beginning of Latin literature. And therefore, it's easy to keep up the story that Roman literary culture is a successor to Greece. It's an inheritor of Greek literary culture. It's not a cadet branch. It's not an ongoing parallel development. It actually takes over. Now, this is not a point of view that means very much nowadays, of course, with the boom in Imperial Greek. But if you look at curricula and reading lists until very recently, you'll see that the Roman view carried the day until not very long ago. And as we'll see, this is certainly a view that Ovid champions in his own sketches of Greek and Roman comparative history. I think it would also be worth investigating Cicero's impact on political theory and even on political practice in Rome. it's hard to get a good fix on Cicero's contribution to literary theory and practice in Rome, even now, partly because the damningly patronizing attitudes of Mommsen and Syme have been devastating to Cicero. I was rather lucky to escape this upbringing. I spent 5 years as a student at Auckland University in New Zealand before I came here to do my doctorate. I took a number of courses on Cicero. W.K. Lacey, of course, was an enormous fan of Cicero. And so I started in 1977. I arrived in Oxford to start my DPhil under the unthinking impression that Cicero was a really brilliant and witty man who counted for a lot in Roman politics. It was a bit of a shock to discover that not everyone in Oxford shared this view. But Cicero was an important figure in Roman politics. And more significantly, for my project, he was a major political theorist and an important innovator in the protocols of Roman political life in the transition to the Principate. And here I can just point you to some important works on the bibliography by Arndt Kerkeker and Andrew Oxhadler in particular. In the so-called caesarean speeches, for example, we can see Cicero feeling his way towards a new kind of rhetoric, one which recognizes the new forms of power, tries to work within them, tries to cope with all of the redefinition of what counts as public and what counts as private that is going on after the revolution. And Cicero is the first person in Rome to try and systematize these issues. And he's doing it on the spot, he's doing it as it's happening. He has a moving target. Jennifer Inglehart, in her commentary on Tristio 2, for example, she's got a very good discussion of how important Cicero's Caesarean speech, the Prologario, is to Ovid's epistle to Augustus, Tristio 2. She develops the parallels very convincingly. Just like his father, Augustus has got the power of clemency, but that's an autocratic power. He can give it as he wills, he can withhold it as he wills. For Ovid, writing from exile in the year 9, this is the status quo. For Cicero, pleading the case of the exiled Ligarius in late 46 BC, this is a revolutionary situation which he is charting systematically for the first time. And Inglehart points out that when Cicero begins his Prologario, he begins by explicitly calling attention to the novelty of the case. His first words in the speech, novum crimen, Gai Caesar, et ante hunc diem non auditur. Now, a big methodological problem in all of these investigations is the problem of thinking about the kinds of models of allusion and intertextuality that we need in order to work on poetry alluding to prose, or poetry working with prose as a model. Our tools for working with poetry alluding to poetry are very good. In fact, I often think they're too good. If you get any 2 bits of ancient literature and give them to a paid-up Latinist, they'll be able to tell you some story about it. With prose alluding to prose, and especially poetry alluding to prose, is a different story. There seems to be a sort of different dynamic at work. There are certainly cases where I think we can see Augustan poets alluding specifically to Ciceronian language. I've given you some examples from Horace's first epistle right at the bottom of the first page of the handout. And Horace's first epistle starts in a very Ciceronian way, claiming that he's going to be eclectic and independent, very much as Cicero consistently does. So, for example, you see Epistle 1:1, the first bit I've given you, nullius additus jurare in verba magistri, the motto of the Royal Society, bound to swear an oath of allegiance to no single master. And this is very Ciceronian language, as you can see from the 2 quotations I've given you next, especially perhaps the one from the Denatura Deorum. He says that he is going to be aequum, libero, judicio, nulla eus modi ad scriptum necessitate. So I'm going to be free, I'm going to be level, even between the parties, with free judgment, and bound by no necessity of that kind of mihi velum nolim sit certo quaedam tuum sententia. That any particular fixed opinion has to be defended by me, whether I want to defend it or not. And then just a few lines after that in Horace's first epistle, non agalisphio et merso civilibus undis, he's talking about his philosophical options. I can be a kind of stoic type who's going to be agalus, I'm going to get involved, I'm going to be submerged in the waves of the state. A virtutis custos rigidusque sateles, an upright guard and champion of virtue. But now, I can do that, or I can be a hedonist. Nunc in aristipi furtum praeceptor labor. But now I slide back imperceptibly into the teachings of Aristippus. This is, I think, unmistakably indebted to the language that Cicero uses in the Academica, where he says, labor eo ut et sentiar Epicuro aut Aristippo. I'm sliding to the point where I'm starting to agree with Epicurus or Aristippus, but revocat virtus, but virtus calls me back. Well, potios reprendet mando, or even more, grabs me with her hand and says no. So this is exactly the kind of thing that we find when poets are reading to poets. The language is similar, but also it's very pointed and twisted. Because Cicero is saying, you know, I start to feel hedonistic every now and then, but no, virtue calls me back. Horace flips it. You know, I feel virtuous, but boy, I just can't help sliding into Epicureanism. So he's reversing what Cicero is saying in a pointed way, which gains more impact if we think of the original. But cases like this are not very common. And in the seminar that we've been running in Oxford for this last term, we're finding some examples of this kind of diction, but we're not finding huge numbers. And even when debts are very clear, there are often no verbal links of any significance. So it's blindingly obvious, for example, that the Somnium Scipionis from the end of the De Republica of Cicero is extraordinarily important to Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid. But there are no allusions at all, and certainly nothing like what I've been suggesting in the case of Horace. But nothing really of any note at all. So the debts are regularly much more diffuse. Intellectual history seems to require different tools from poetic illusion. Now, I'm still feeling my way here very much, trying to develop models, trying to think about ways which can do justice to the pervasive influence that Cicero had on Roman intellectual and literary culture, while allowing us not to get hung up on the lack of the kind of elusive features that we instinctively look for in verse traditions. Well, that's some kind of overview of what look like the major issues at this preliminary stage, to give you some idea of why I think it might be worth bringing some Ciceronian perspective to bear on the way that Ovid might have conceived of literary history. Still, as I said at the beginning, I don't want to claim that Ovid is all Cicero all the time when he's doing literary history. Ovid's brilliance as an observer of his literary traditions is acknowledged by everyone. And it varies. It's hugely ad hoc and eclectic. He's writing literary history from the beginning of his career. The closing poem of his very first book of poetry, More 1, page 2 of the handout, is a literary historical survey. In this first literary historical essay of his, we can see Ovid exemplifying the force of Richard Tarrant's aphorism in the paper he wrote on Ovid as an ancient literary historian. And Tarrant says, Ovid's characteristic literary historical gesture is the list. Now, the list is, of course, a favourite part of Hellenistic scholarly work, one that quickly became part of the Roman tradition. The list of canonical authors became a mainstay of Hellenistic scholarship, and you can see an example on the handout, after the Ovid poem, of a Roman case of adapting this kind of scholarship. This is the mini canon of the wonderfully named Volcacius Sedigitus, 6 fingers Volcacius. He's writing probably in the late 2nd century BC, sorry. And you can see him here, multos in keratos, ketara, hankarang, vidimus. We've seen a whole lot of people wrangling in uncertainty over this question, this topic. Halaman poetae comico cui deferat, to which comic poet they should give a palm. And I'm going to sort this all out, he says, with my judicium, with my crisis. I'm going to be the criticos. I'm going to be the man who can solve this question. So you can see in line 5, for him, the palm should go to Caecilius Statius, Plautus number 2, Naevius number 3, line 10, shockingly perhaps for us, Terence number 6, and in line 13, Ennius number 10, just because he's so old. Now, Ovid's list in Memorias 115 is one that works very knowingly with this tradition, as it builds to his triumphant claim that Ovid will be as famous as everyone on that list of poets going back to Homer. It's an amazing claim for someone in his early 20s. He's only got 14 poems so far behind him. But it's actually not so extraordinary in the end, because in the year 2014, Ovid is much more famous than anyone on his list, apart from Homer, Sophocles, and Virgil. So you can see that he starts with Homer in line 9, and then he goes on through a list of Greek poets until line 19, 19 and 20, he switches over to the Romans with Ennius and then with Accius. So Ovid here is following the rules of this scholarly game, especially in not including the names of any poets still alive. Virgil and Tibullus are mentioned, so the poem must be published after the year 19 when they died. Propertius and Horace are not in there, presumably because they're still alive. Now, obviously, the main reason they're not mentioned is because his argument in the poem is, even when they're dead, famous poets live on, and so it wouldn't do any good to mention living poets. But in addition to that, he's following this rule that Hellenistic scholarship followed, that only dead artists can be in the canon and be the subject of ranking and assessment. If you turn over the page, you can see this principle at work in the end of Propertius 234, which is a model for us to understand. In this poem, too, living poets are not in the catalogue. There's no Tibullus. When Propertius gives this little mini Hellenistic canon, as you can see in that little bit that I've just given you, he adopts the rule of the form. You can't be a classic until you're dead. Still, there are some big differences between this little catalogue and Propertius and the names of Ovid. First of all, in Ovid, we get more than one genre. In Propertius, as you can see, it's all love elegy. Varro is a love elegist, Catullus, Caldus, and Gallus. In Ovid, on the other hand, there's a range of genres, and when he mentions Varro, he mentions him as an epic poet, not as a love poet. So he's more comprehensive. Love elegy, in Ovid's presentation, is one genre among many. Secondly, in Ovid, we get a parade of Greek names first, and then a parade of Roman names. This is actually quite unusual when Latin poets give catalogues of names of predecessors. Like Propertius's list, they tend to be just Roman names. But Ovid has got Homer and Hesiod and Callimachus and Sophocles and Aratus and Menander before he goes over to the Latin list. And here you can see the force of Gregory Hutchinson's insight in particular, that Roman literary history picks up when Greek stops, because Callimachus chronologically is the latest of the Greek authors that Ovid mentions, and Callimachus died about 1 or 2 years before Ennius was born in the year 239, so the latest Greek poet, the first poet, had this nice little match. So Ovid is very fond of these lists. I've given you a list of Ovid's lists. On page 3 there of the handout. Obviously, we can't go through all these, we'd still be here at dinner time. So I'm going to skip to the end of Ovid's career and look at the view from Exile. And even here I'm going to be ruthless. I'm not going to say anything in detail about his brilliant rewriting of literary history in his epistle to Augustus, for example, in Tristram 2. I haven't got anything from Tristram 2 in your handout, it's too long. It's about 100 lines long, as you can see from the précis there. Basically, his line when he does literary history in the epistle to Augustus is to say, how come I'm getting picked up for writing love poetry? The whole of Greek literature is really about love, according to Ovid. And he goes through. The Iliad is all about Achilles and Briseis. It's all about Helen, the adulteress. The Odyssey is all about Penelope being wooed by the suitors. And in the Odyssey, you also got that story about Ares and Aphrodite, about Mars and Venus, and so on. And you got the love affairs with Circe and Calypso. So the Odyssey is really a love story. And then after talking about epic in this way, Ovid goes through all of Attic drama. It says it's all really about aberrant sexual obsessions and passion. This redescription of world literature as really being all about sex all the time is the kind of thing that used to irritate the professionals very much until 20 years ago or so. People found it hard to take Ovid seriously. It seemed simply flippant. But Ovid is a brilliant reader and a brilliant critic. And this passage, it's funny, obviously, that I think we should take what he says about reception and literary history seriously here. In the case of tragedy, no modern critic would dream of contesting Ovid's claim that the genre is profoundly concerned with the exploration of sexual transgression and obsession. In the case of the Odyssey as well, Ovid looks eerily ahead of his time. Margaret Atwood's novel in 2005, The Penelope Act, put Penelope at the center of the epic. But Ovid reminds us that she was always at the center of the epic all the time anyway. We don't need to turn Ovid into some kind of feminist or modern expert in order to see that he has put his finger with incredible deftness on many of the issues that interest modern scholars now when they read the Odyssey. So we're living in a second Aetas Ovidiana at the moment, and our readings of the canon that Ovid goes through in this section of the poem, our readings have got much more in common with Ovid's than with those of any other ancient author. Whatever else Ovid may be doing throughout this very detailed and long passage in the Tristia, he's always protesting against the dead hand of literary historical tradition. So I'm quite confident that Horace learns a lot from Cicero about the pitfalls of comparative literary history between Greece and Rome, and about the pitfalls of teleology and periodization in literary history. And Jim May, in the article on your handout, is, I think, onto something very important in the sketch of the similarities that Horace constructed between his career and Cicero's. And so I want to suggest now that Ovid's presentation of his career and his place in Roman literary history is also indebted both to Cicero and to Cicero in Horace. And Cicero's Brutus is the main text here, which is really an extraordinarily rich and original work of scholarship and theory. In the Brutus, Cicero gets hold of a number of strands of Hellenistic scholarship and reworks them in powerful ways. It's not obvious that anyone before Cicero, for example, had written a dialogue with a historical survey as its subject. Phil Hawkey and Tobias Reinhardt have suggested to me that there may be philosophical prototypes in the lost works of Aristotle in the Peripatetics, or even Antiochus of Ascalon, who's the academic who taught Cicero. There may be prototypes of dialogues that survey philosophical movements over time, philosophical schools and developments over time. That's possible. I'll have to do some more digging around to be sure of this. Another of the most important innovations of Cicero's in the Brutus is the way that he makes literary history autobiographical. His history of rhetoric, which becomes a history of Roman rhetoric, is reshaped by having Cicero write himself into the story, into literary rhetoric. He becomes the telos of the history of oratory. Now, as far as I can see, Cicero is the first prose author to write extensive intellectual autobiography. It's been suggested to me that Isocrates could be a forerunner in some respects, and I'm certainly going to have to follow that up. Now, I don't want to say that Cicero was the first Roman politician to write autobiography. There are many people before him who wrote autobiographical works of various kinds. But so far as I've managed to find out, no orator or historian or philosopher before Cicero had written a sustained piece of artistic or intellectual autobiography of the kind that we see in the Brutus, except maybe Socrates. Cicero may be flagging his self-awareness on this point in his ironic remarks at the beginning of the main section of his autobiography towards the end of the Brutus. This is on page 4 of the handout. You can see, if you look at the Brutus passage there, talking to Brutus and Atticus, he says, "Since it appears to be your wish to know me through and through, not just by birthmark or oracle, but by my whole body, I'll include some particulars which may seem superfluous. I was, in those days when I was young, very slender and far from robust. My neck was long and thin." And he goes into quite a lot of detail about his physique. He goes into quite a lot of detail about the difficulties that his weak body presented for his oratorical training. It's all a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I mean, it is important to build that picture of what kind of person he is and what kind of experience he had. And I'm reminded of Plutarch's famous remarks at the beginning of his Alexander. You can see a few lines down from the beginning of this, where he says, "It is not histories that I'm writing, but lives. And in the most illustrious deeds, it is not always a manifestation of virtue or vice, but a slight thing, like a glance or a jest, often makes a greater revelation of character." So if the kind of remark that Plutarch is making there is something of a cliche, Cicero may be applying a topos of biography to himself. It's the apparently small and inconsequential things that can actually be particularly revealing. Cicero's autobiography is particularly original in that he presents it as intertwined with the biography of his older contemporary Quintus Hortensius. And I've given you an important section on page 5 of the handout. Brutus begins talking about the death of Hortensius, and Hortensius is a very important figure all the way through. So at the top of that page 5, you can see there Cicero saying, at that time, this is when Cicero first came to Rome, came back to Rome after his training in Asia in the year 76. At that time, 2 orators stood out above the rest to invite my emulation, Cotta and Hortensius. And a few lines after that, comparing the two, I saw that Hortensius was the man I had to do with. In warmth of style, I was more like him, and I was nearer in point of age. Aetate conjunctio. From here you get an idea of how important to Cicero and Brutus is the sense of time and periodization. This is a key preoccupation all the way through. He's clustering orators into different periods, into different aetates. He's trying to flesh out a historical periodization for the development of Roman oratory. But this time relationship is particularly significant when he's dealing with the relationship between himself and Hortensius. So, as I just said, pointing out this passage when he comes back from Asia in 76, there are 2 up there, 2 big figures on the oratorical scene. If you look at section 333, which I've given you just under that other extract, Cicero points out, don't we see that in each period, scarcely so many as 2 orators have maintained the place of distinction? It's unusual to have 2 really powerful figures at once. Normally you only get 1. He gives examples, Galba, Cato, and so on. But then, towards the end of that little extract, he says, sometimes there are pairs, Antonius and Crassus, and then Cotta and Sulpicius, and then Hortensius, nihil dico emperus. We can fill that in, Hortensius. Me. Now, if you go back to the longer extract above that, and look at section 318, you see how carefully he plots his time relationship with these 2 massive predecessors. In 318, during the first year after my return from Asia, I pleaded some conspicuous cases. Cum quaestura nos consulatum Cotta aedilitatem cetere Hortensius. This is a wonderful illustration of how the Lex Vilia Annidus gave Roman aristocrats and politicians an almost spatial sense of their relationship with each other. There were specific age times at which you could hit the base of the individual officers as you went up the cursus honorum. And then they had these ingrained in their DNA. They knew how it felt, and so they were able to keep as I say, almost spatial sense of who was just behind them, who was level with them, who was just behind them in this progress. And this mentality is everywhere in Brutus. Now, ultimately, this interest in charting the relative ages and periods of important orators in Brutus must go back to Hellenistic scholarship's interest in the acmi, the peaks, and the chronoi, the epochs of various artistic and literary figures, and how they fit into their political era. Atticus's Liberalis, which Cicero generously acknowledges earlier in Brutus, must have been an example of this genre. And it's a terrible shame that we haven't got that book. It obviously made an enormous impact on Cicero. He talks about it. He's not just being polite to an old friend, but really does seem to have changed the way that he thought about how you can plot historical events and figures in the past. And whatever else it had in it, the Liberalis of Atticus would have had Greek archons, so that you could plot things on the Greek side, and had literary historical figures as well as political figures. And on the Roman side, you've got consuls and you've got Roman artistic and literary figures too. But Cicero, I think, is going well beyond this. Partly he's reworking that Hellenistic mode of scholarship by plotting it into major currents of Roman political history, especially the Social War and the First Civil War. And partly, as I said earlier, he's reworking it by making it autobiographical. He even carries on down to the end of his own career, section 328 at the bottom of page 5. You can see there, he says, talking about himself and Hortensius again, Hortensius' career was one of success from the consulship of Crassus and Scaevola, it's 95 BC, down to Paulus and Marcellus in 50 BC. Mine was parallel to his. In fact, if you look at the Latin, you see it's a chariot racing metaphor. Nos in eodum cursum fuimus. We were on the same lap, so we were going around the course together. Thus, the voice of Hortensius was silenced only by his own death, mine by the death of the Republic. So that's the end of his career, so he thought. So I think there are many connections between these patterns in Cicero's Brutus and what we can see. First of all, in Horace's literary epistles, we see in the Epistle to Florus, for example, at the top of page 6 of the handout, epistles 2:2, here we get an autobiographical passage about Horace's early life, with his philosophical training in the University of Athens, the disastrous impact of the Civil War, and his eventual discovery of his real career as a poet. And in the Epistle to Augustus, I think Horace shows how important Cicero is to him in all kinds of respects, especially in the self-presentation as a lonely and misunderstood figure at the end of his career, someone under attack for his aesthetic stances, someone who simply can't understand the popularity of the models who are admired by the opposition. Cicero just doesn't see what these fans of the Attica are on. Horace simply can't understand what contemporaries of his can see in the veterans of real merit, in Ennius, in Plautus, and so on. I don't want to suggest that Cicero is the only model. I mean, Callinicus is obviously an important model for someone who's attacked at the end of his career and trying to justify himself. And as Barbara Graziosi has shown, Horace's self-presentation throughout his work is deeply involved with the biographies, or Hellenistic biographies, of the canonical Greek poets. So Horace is reading those biographies of the Greek poets, and he knows that he's going to have biographies like that written about himself, and he plots his self-representation within that tradition as if to anticipate it. So there are other things going on that I think Cicero is certainly one. I think Cicero's Brutus is also important to Ovid, especially in the two major poems from Exile, in which he situates his own work within an autobiographical framework and a periodization framework as well. Ovid's autobiography in Tristia 4:10, that's page 6 of the handout, starts with his birth. He carefully locates this event in time. See line 6 for the year, from Cepidet Fato Consul Utera Pari, or 43 BC, and then lines 13 and 14 for the day and the month, corresponding to March the 20th, as Gesine Manuel pointed out in her introduction, during the Feast of the Queen Quatreus. So he, from the start, he wanted to be a poet. And you can see his father saying to the young Ovid what all the parents of all of our students are saying to them in line 21, Studium quid inutile temptas. Why are you taking such a useless course? So this is the way his father was talking to the young Ovid, but Ovid bucked him. Ovid decided to go ahead. He could have had a senatorial career, Ovid says, but his body and temperament were not up to it in line 37. Nec patiens corpus nec mens fuit apta labori. Now here, this is unlike Cicero. Cicero, in the passage we were just looking at, says that he had a weak body and a long neck and he wasn't really up to it. But he dedicated himself for years of rigorous physical training in order to be able to achieve his ambition. Ovid said, I can't be bothered with that. In line 41, this is over on page 7 of the handout now, using language very like that of Cicero and Brutus, Ovid pinpoints an age cohort. Temporis ilius colui fovi poetas. The poets of that time I fondly reverenced. Here he's putting himself in the position relative to the greats of his youth, rather as Cicero does in the Brutus. He situates Maccaire as a different generation from himself in line 43. He's mihi grandior aevo, so he's up above him in terms of age. In line 45 we meet Propertius, who was the great figure of Ovid's youth. For him, a friend of his, so he says, Ovid says that he heard him recite, even though Propertius' first book probably came out when Ovid was about 15. The next two names, Pontus Ambassadors, these are hard. I believe Peter Heslin's story about these two guys. Basically, Peter Heslin says that Propertius invented Ponticus as a straw man, just a name, Mr. Big Sea, Big Ocean, as a kind of straw man for epic, that he can attack when he feels like it. And Peter Heslin argues that Bassus is Propertius' pseudonym for Horace. That's hard. I'm really not quite sure about this. I want to believe Peter Heslin, I think he's probably right. Anyway, so that's hard. But apart from these two, Ponticus and Bassus, Ovid, in the section that you see in front of you, is talking here about real players, important poets. Maccaire, Propertius, Horace, Virgil, Tibullus, and Gallus. He's doing what Cicero does in the Brutus. He's picking out the key figures in each period, and he's talking about their relationship in time to each other, especially in lines 53 and 54. You can see, Successor fuit liciti Galle, Propertius ili, quartus ab his serie temporis ipsa fui. Tibullus was your successor, Gallus, and Propertius was his, and after them came I, fourth in order of time. So people are being slotted into a sequence here. There's no anxiety of influence here. It's a collegial image, as you often get in Roman imagery, of people, magistrates, handing on responsibility for office to their successors. One very big difference here in this poem is that Ovid does not have a peer, as Hortensius was for Cicero, or as Virgil and Varius were for Horace. So there's no cohorts, there's no peer, there's no real competitor for Ovid. In line 55, you can see Ovid says, as I reverenced older poets, so was I reverenced by the younger. So by implication, he represents himself as the sole genuinely standout figure of his particular itas. In fact, he manages to give the impression that he's the sole standout figure of his itas in two genres. He's the successor to Propertius in the tradition of love poetry. He's also the successor to Virgil in the tradition of epic, as the poet of the Metamorphoses. And this is in line 51, that little phrase that I mentioned earlier, veri video vidi tantor, which looks very unaffected, but in fact, I think it was quite a major claim. I was the heir of Virgil. And then at the end of the poem, I've given you, after the dots, in line 125, nam tulurentum magnos cum saecula nostra poetas. So again, talking about the period as a whole, epoch as a whole. It's not the itas of a particular generation of poets. Saecula is a much bigger word. This is the whole epoch from Virgil on down. So in Tristia 410, we have an autobiography where time relations matter a lot, where important predecessors get their due measure, and where the author is slotted into the right kind of relationship in time and influence vis-a-vis his predecessors. And again, I think this is a very Ciceronian way of viewing how literary works. Ovid's other exilic poetic catalogue poem is Ponto 416, which is the next item on the handout. It may look rather similar on the surface, but it is in fact very different. Instead of canonical and revered figures, we get a plethora of non-entities. You could set a master's exam by giving this poem to your students and asking them to identify these people. I mean, they're really hardly in the Oxford Classical Dictionary, most of them. This poem reinforces even more strongly than Tristia 410 the idea that Ovid is the only significant figure of his age. The only poet of any real standing mentioned in this poem is Maccaire, in line 6. I mean, some of these people wrote things that survive, and they're not amateurs. They're not Virgil. They're not really important people. So Maccaire, perhaps Varius, the friend of Virgil and of Horace, the poet of the Thyestes. You'll find him in line 31, at the top of page 8. But actually, that probably isn't the famous Varius. The manuscripts have Varus, which won't work, and Martin Hutzler, in his edition commentary, puts a dagger like that, and he says, we don't know who this person was. One of his main reasons for doing that is that it can't be the famous Varius, because this famous Varius is long dead, and all of the other people in this poem, it seems, apart from Sabinus in line 16, are alive. And Helzer makes a very good point that it's important that Ovid has transformed the standard catalogue of dead predecessors into a catalogue of living contemporaries. And then, as he says, the poet, on the contrary, is not alive anymore, but presents himself as dead. All the way through the Exile poetry, Ovid is saying, I'm really dead, I'm really dead. And here, in the very last poem that he ever wrote, probably, he cashes that idea out in very strong terms. I am the dead classic. All these other people still alive, they don't deserve to be canonized, they don't deserve to be ranked. All of the real talent, the other really dead classics, are sitting anonymously in lines 37 to 38. Namque farent alii, quorum mihi culto referi nona longa mor est caramana vulgus hebet. That's Virgil, that's Horace, that's all the real talent sitting in there, and he doesn't name. So I think this is a very different perspective from the earlier club. And I think the only link that we can perhaps establish with the Brutus is the address to Cotta Maximus starting in line 41. Cotta Maximus is someone he talks to a lot in Exile poetry, and here in line 41, Te tamen in turba non ausum cotta celera. But you, amongst this crowd, I wouldn't dare to pass over in silence. I've got to mention you, Cotta. Among the throng of unnamed younger people, there is one who deserves mention as possibly having real potential. This reminds me a bit, rightly or wrongly, of the way that Cicero addresses Brutus at the end of the dialogue. This is the last item on the handout, section 331, the last bit of the handout, when Cicero says to Brutus, I grieve more deeply when I look on you, Brutus, whose youthful career, faring in triumph amidst the general applause, has been thwarted by the onset of the malign fortune, by the death of the Veritas in the of Caesar. Actually, the Loeb translation misses the metaphor here. The Loeb translation has Brutus riding along in a triumphal chariot, but it's another chariot racing metaphor. Per medias laudes quasi quadrigis vehentem transversa incurret misera fortuna. So Brutus gets sideswiped. He's riding, going along, everyone's cheering, and this other chariot, as it were, bangs into him side on. Otherwise, in Ovid's last poem, we see no chronological order, no pattern, no chain of succession, just a list of people who, on the whole, don't really matter. There are no meaningful contours to the presentation here. It reminds me very much of Gareth Ealing's excellent remarks on the way that conventional markers of Roman time become redundant in the exile poetry. Gareth Williams talking about the birthday, for example. He says, the Roman birthday is a marker of time and progress in life, is redundant in exile, where Ovid's existence lacks all positive development and the years merge into each other without meaningful distinction. So this final poem, I think, is a very bitter version of the literary histories of Cicero and of Horace. But even in its bitterness, I think his presentation of his place in Roman literary history in this poem and in the exile poetry in general owes a great deal both to Horace and to Horace's Cicero. Cicero and Horace and Ovid all end up positioning themselves as isolated and misunderstood figures, lost survivors of a great generation, the last men standing, living on beyond their time, forced to defend their art against pygmies. Thank you.